My name is Megan. I am the practice lead for the TAC team here at TrustedSec. We do a lot of purple teaming work. And I'll hand it off to Carlos to do his introduction.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm the Director of Security Intelligence here at TrustedSec. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this webinar. We'll be discussing a lot of the stuff that Megan and I are constantly chatting about and going like, we wish customers would do this. I wish this customer would do that. And then as I help out with incident response engagements and stuff like that, in the middle of it, I go like, yeah, I wish they did this.
So we
Cool.
thought, what better way to do that than to have a webinar and talk about it and hopefully give all the people out there some really good information to take back to their companies and their organizations or even their lab environments and work through some of this stuff and see what can be done.
Yeah. So in today's digital landscape, understanding what to log and how to efficiently monitor these logs is crucial for maintaining a robust security defense. And this is why we're actually doing this webinar. So initially, when we go into some of our customers or where we're working in this response, one of the things that we've noticed is that logging is either partial or not there. And there's a really big importance for everybody to be logging properly and also looking at the logs, especially looking. Sometimes I'll go in and we'll see all of the attack behavior is in the alerts in the AV and the alerts in the EDR, but nobody was looking into it. So the first part that we want to start with is the importance of logging in cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of building on what Carlos sort of introduced there, if you don't have the telemetry and if you don't have the logging available to you, primarily we're speaking of within a SIEM platform, you lose out on a lot of opportunities to really see what's going on in your environment holistically, not just from a detecting attacker behavior perspective, but also identifying misconfigurations, abnormalities, things that might need to be fixed, things that might need to be addressed, and things that you can baseline to really understand what is actually normal for your environment, as opposed to what might be abnormal. And that's a big part of that as well, is not just the detection on the attacks, but the detection of what's normal and what's abnormal.
And this is something that you don't need to start if you don't have a, like, for example, some customers will go, I still don't have a SIM, we're still working on it. And my advice to you is start enabling it, start growing, going through the process of what should I set up? How should I set it up? What should we monitor? What we shouldn't monitor as you're building that SIM infrastructure? Because many times when we go into an environment and we're working in a response engagement, we're working a purple team engagement, some of the times having all of those logs already in the host becomes a lot more important because the data is already there. We can start working with it and we can start ingesting and processing that data. So don't go like, this is something that I cannot do until I have a SIM. This is something that you can actually start before you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's other tools, and we'll get into that a little bit later in this webinar. There's other tools that you can use to try to start centralizing your logging without necessarily having a SIM, but to have access to them in a repository. Ultimately, as well, there's a lot of vendors coming out there that have a data lake option or something of the sort that would allow you to centralize that logging and at least have it in storage to be able to be searched in tandem with an EDR product or another one. So that is also an option for that if you aren't at a point yet where you have the resources or the ability to configure like a traditional enterprise SIM.
Yeah. And it's also important to have training for the logging tools and the security tools that you're implementing in your environment. And this is something that I see happen a lot. So as Director of Security Intelligence, I get to talk a lot with CISOs, I get to talk a lot with managers. And as we're chatting about what are their plans that they're planning for this quarter, the next quarter, what are their worries, what is the approach that they're going to be taking, how are they planning everything out. One of the things that I've noticed is that in many environments, they'll go like, oh yeah, we got to spend $200,000 on Blinky boxes. and the blinky boxes are going to give me some insight, and it's going to block a lot of stuff. And then when the vendor comes and says, oh, those blinky boxes, you need to now spend $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, not that much, versus the price of the blinky boxes in training, they go like, oh no, that's too expensive. Yeah, you need training. It's like, for example, my daughter is at the age that she's learning to drive. And if I teach her how to do everything in automatic, will I buy her a manual transmission and then go like, go for it, baby? That's not going to turn out very well.
Going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah, an expensive one too.
Yeah, and I think building on that too, it's like anything else. A tool is only as good as the person or the team using it. And if you don't have the knowledge on how to operate the tool, it really isn't providing the maximum value. There's a lot of enterprise tools out there. I'm thinking of tools like Tanium, for example, which does a lot of really great functions within an organization in terms of asset management and inventorying, various EDR products. But if they aren't first of all, if they aren't configured properly because the team isn't aware of how they are deployed or doesn't know exactly how the software is working, you limit the actual value of that tool in your environment. And you've also now just added something else to your team that now has a responsibility to maintain a tool that they maybe don't even have the cycles to maintain. So that's something to consider as well.
Yeah. Also, when it comes to like, what are some of those common security threats and incidents that you should be focusing on, why you should be logging, is that I have found myself having many conversations with customers when it comes to ransomware. That is one of the hot topics that has been year to year. And they come to me and they go like, hey, Carlos, this is our plan right now for recovery. And we're going to recover very fast. We have storage area networks that are replicating across data centers, plus replicating to the cloud. So in case of an incident, we can quickly pull all of our backup data and restore as quickly as possible. We have even identified what systems we need to bring up and everything. Go like, okay, that's awesome. So what is your plan for root cause? And they go like, what do you mean root cause? Well, until you know how the actor got in, what tools are they using, how they move laterally inside of your environment, and for how long have they been there, you cannot do any of that restoration. All of that backup plan is the end result. And that is one of the things that it's so important for you to have a clear logging solution, because you're going to be able to provide those answers. How long have they been in my environment? 3 months. So I'm going to start restoring data from 4 months ago because I don't want to give them access back to my environment. How are they moving laterally in my environment? What tools are they using? I got to go back into my logs and start and go like, oh, they're doing it this way. And we found the bitch servers that they were using kind of like to spread across the network. And this was the techniques that they were using. Now I can go into my logs and say, this systems, we know there was no activity. We can start restoring those as quickly as possible. This other systems, we got to go into the backups and start searching for them for some of the IOCs. And given how tape works, given how some of those storage area network solutions work, it takes a while to do that searching. So logging actually pays off when it comes to those incidents.
Well, on top of that, too, if you're restoring from a backup during a critical incident, perhaps it's ransomware, perhaps it's something else, how do you know you aren't actually restoring access to the attacker as well if you don't have the logging data available to search through? If you don't have a time frame that's applicable for your investigation, you may very well restore a system back to a point where the attacker maybe did have initial access to a system, and depending on the nature of that access, could potentially restore that particular access for the attacker too, which is also something to consider. And if you have the logging available to be able to find this information out, to make sure that any potential user accounts have had passwords changed, or machine accounts, or all the actual IOCs and the things that were changed during the attack or during the attacker's behavior on the network, you've removed all their methods of privilege escalation, you also help reduce that risk. And that's all going to come from effective logging.
Yeah, and a recent example of that, it was CDK. CDK started acting initially, and They thought that they had everything under control, and they started to do a restoration of their systems. And then sadly, during the restoration process, the attacker came back, either because it was their access was restored, or they missed something big in the attack chain that the attacker was using against them, and the attacker came back with a vengeance. So that's a great example where probably doing a deeper dive into your logs and looking at all of the behavior that was shown there and looking for the outliers and all of that could have paid off.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's where those logs come into play too, because if you have well-built detections, you have logging enabled on your workstations, on your endpoints, you're ingesting those EDR logs, firewall logs, you can go in and you can actually potentially even catch the attacker behavior before it becomes a huge incident. You can contain it faster. So there's value in it from an incident response perspective, a post-mortem after an actual breach, but also from a um, early IOC of something's not quite right here. We need to take an investigation, which might help you actually prevent that breach in the long run. So definitely, there's a lot of value in logging. And again, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but especially in those workstation logs, making sure that you are ingesting all of your endpoint logs and stuff like that to be able to
Mhm.
identify these things early rather than waiting till it hits, maximum impact.
Yeah, and that brings up the question: what do we log? What are those key data sources that we should be logging for? And I think if we start going and focusing, let's start with Windows, logins and logouts. That's important. That
Mhm.
gives us that time frame of the actor, so we can look at that logon ID, startup, log on, log off. Now we have a time window that we can start searching those logs.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to just logins, logoffs, event ID 4624, in this case, is what we're talking about, and event ID 4625 would be the primary focuses from an actual event ID perspective in that area. Obviously, there's loads of other login
Mhm.
tracking events out there as well. But from those logins and logouts, you also get really other information that's also critically valuable. You get source IP addresses, you get
Mhm.
tied login ID processes that can help you tie that event to other events that are happening on the network. So you can actually trace the login behavior straight through that process based on that field. It enables you to build detections for brute force attacks like password spraying, um,
Mhm.
both from a 4624 and a 4625 perspective. It allows you to build some additional context with things like null binding, with pass the hash, and other things that are common attacker behavior from either an attempt to gain initial access or trying to move laterally on the network.
Yeah, and some examples for that is, let's say that you have a modern Windows environment and you've been able to keep up to date with everything that's going on. Your environment is going to be mostly Kerberos. So you're going to be looking at your 4624s and you're going to see that that provider is going to be Kerberos. There's going to be some NTLM outliers. And all of a sudden you start seeing user accounts using NTLM. You know that something's off. There's an outlier there. Probably past the hash. Somebody was able to send a crafted email, for example, the recent MS-HTML bug via Outlook that forces a connection that then exfiltrates that NTLM package out of your network, and they're able to capture that and reuse that in your environment. You're going to be able to find those outliers. And for me, as I'm working sometimes in incident response, I see that a lot of people log for the 4624s, but not the 4625s. And what happens there is that logon IDs get reused, and they get reused very quickly. So all of a sudden, I don't have, and most of the events out there kind of like match that logon ID and bake it into their data for other events. So if I don't have a time window for that logon ID, I'm going to be catching a lot of shaft or a lot of noise out there in my signal from other logons that don't play a role in the incident itself. So when we say 4624, we also mean 4625 should also be there. because that provides us a lot of context as we're doing hunting, as we're doing detection, to identify the attacker's behavior. Now, the next one, which is, I think, one of the biggest ones, especially when it comes to your desktops, is process creation, 4688.
Or Sysmon 1, if you are a Sysmon shop, both work.
Yep.
Not an either or situation, though. We should say you should have both.
Yeah.
But yeah, those process creation events. I think when Carlos and I were discussing this previously, when spitballing ideas for this, what was it, Carlos? You said about something like 70% of all attacks being able to be detected or
Yeah.
something by that particular event type.
Yeah. So
Um,
when you look at MITRE, it actually accounts for 75 to 80% of
mhm.
all tracking for the behaviors that are part of the MITRE framework. You can actually track those or associate those to some of the metadata that is in your 4688 or your Sysmon 1.
Yeah, absolutely. And having those specifically, not just from your domain controllers and your servers, but also from your endpoints. I think where we see a lot of organizations um, maybe have challenges is when they aren't logging those events from the workstations. They say we have EDR coverage on our endpoints. We don't necessarily need to ingest the event IDs from our workstations and endpoints because, well, we're covered with our EDR, right? And while we definitely think that that's a really good point, EDR is a great tool to have. We should absolutely be ingesting these event IDs from the workstations. 4688 specifically here is where we're going to see a lot of commands from really early reconnaissance attempts, other critical factors, LOL bin techniques specifically that
Mhm.
perhaps an EDR tool may acknowledge but not necessarily identify as malicious because it is a normal system binary. Um, those can all be detected for the most part with that specific event ID 4688. Uh, the second part that I see, I've seen very frequently within the last, I'll say, about calendar year, where organizations are having some issues with the process creation events, is they have gone into Active Directory. They have enabled 4688 process creation event within their GPO. But what many people don't know is you have to do two things to enable the process creation events. And this is very, very frequently missed. I don't know why it was configured this way. I'll be real, it's really confusing. But just for everybody here, I would definitely recommend taking this back to your organization and making sure this is done. Once you've actually enabled that event ID, you have to go into a separate part of the event GPO configuration for this advanced security logs. And it specifically is navigated to the path administrative templates, system audit, process creation. And within that specific path there is something that says include command line in process creation events. And if that is not set to enabled, you are going to get the event ID 4688 within the SIEM, but you are not actually going to get the process command line for that event.
Yeah.
Which means you're missing out on the valuable telemetry that that event is supposed to bring. So,
A lot.
um,
It gives you
yeah,
the context of what the executable is actually doing to have it.
right.
I actually know the story of why it is that way.
Oh,
I'm a Microsoft MVP. So on a yearly basis, we get to all Microsoft MVPs. We do our migration over to headquarters over at Microsoft, and we get to talk with the different product groups. And I remember talking with part of the Windows product group, their security guys, and we're like, "Why do you guys have it that way? Why do you did it that way?" And this was around 8, 9 years ago. Um, when it was added on Windows 2008. And I remember one of them was frustrated, looked down at the floor and was telling me, manager, our product managers were worried about privacy, that if this got enabled, uh, people were going to be finding passwords and all kinds of other private data in the logs, and they didn't want to add that. So they wanted to make it extra sure that somebody enabled that. And I was going like, so if you're including passwords, clear text in your command lines, you have another problem that is
Yeah,
not privacy.
right.
But yeah, product managers, they tend to be like that a bit.
Okay, well, now we know. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think at the very least, it's definitely saying it is not. I think out of, like I said, out of the last calendar year, every client I've worked with, about three-quarters of them have been missing that field. They are either don't have the event ID enabled at all, or they have it enabled, but they don't have that second part enabled, which means the value is then halved and limited in terms of what you can get from that event ID. So
Yeah.
obviously, uh, there's some like challenges in that in terms of where that's placed in the logs. But like I said, if we can say anything, if you take anything from this webinar, go back to your organizations, check and make sure that that field is enabled. That way, that's one less issue that you're going to find if you come into Trusted Sec for a purple team, or you do another engagement that's detection based.
And as we mentioned, process creation and command line plays a super big role. Either if you're doing a purple team or you're doing managing an incident, that is kind of like the number one thing that we want to see, is that you have process creation and the command line there. Um, you'll be surprised how many times I found a bunch of stuff and go like, oh, low bin attack, and then they go like, oh no, we do use it in part of our scripts, and then I'm racking my head like, which one of this could be malicious and which one is not. Without that command line, I have no clue. So it becomes super important to have that. Like, if you ask anybody inside of the incident response team right now what event they wish they had, it's going to be this one with the command line logging. Now,
Yeah.
and one that Megan and I were talking, and this is for those that have that and are looking to something else to have enabled in their environment, is going to be registry related events. Those become super important in terms of a more granular type of detections that you can actually write. That's going to be event 4657.
Correct. Yeah. So sort of very similar to process command line auditing. There's a lot, obviously there's a lot that goes into Windows and the registry auditing stuff. I've been talking to Carlos again beforehand here, but I've been working on some blog related stuff regarding, browser extension installation and some other like credential theft from the browser. And one of the big ways that you can detect like the installation of a browser extension, for example, is through the registry. There's also a lot of other attacks from a red team perspective that definitely target the registry to add keys, to enable persistence, to change something to gain access to the system. There's stuff like sticky keys, other registry related events that really can they can be detected if those logs are enabled, and they can really give you a heads up that, again, somebody is doing something that they maybe should not be doing on that system, particularly if you see, for example, Deborah in accounting who's, you know, adding a bunch of stuff to the registry that might give you a sign that something's up. So
Yeah, in fact, to address one of the questions that we have so far in chat, one of them is, what are the recommended steps for addressing an immature SIEM platform, and what should be prioritized? This question assumes that the logging portion is already addressed. And this goes with what we're talking right now, which is initially what you're going to do is that you want to identify a series of attacks that you want to have coverage for. You'll base this either on threat intel or behaviors or other stuff that you're seeing in the news, either from your red team or pen test reports that you're identifying like, hey, we have gaps in coverage of this type of behavior. From that, you're going to be looking at what are the data sources that I need to identify there for that known behavior. And that is how you then prioritize, given what is the risk of that technique to your environment, what are the data sources I have to have enabled for that? And then working on the detections and the permutations of those attacks. So it's a kind of like a full process that Megan's team goes through with the customer. And that's why we're going for the events that kind of like pay the more dividends. What are those events that will allow you to cover the greatest amount of gaps that you may have there? So we have the logons, we have the process creation with command line, and then now we're discussing the registry. So you're identifying all of those.
And again, this is from a workstation perspective as well, not just your domain controllers and your servers, because think of it from this perspective, right? The most likely path for an attacker to get into the organization is going to be on a user's workstation, classic endpoint stuff, right? Either maybe by a phishing email that gets sent, they click the link, it downloads some software, they get access to that host on the network, they're able to move from that perspective. If you don't have the event IDs and the logging enabled, and you don't have that in a centralized position to be able to search through easily and on demand, you're going to miss out on that telemetry. And again, EDRs are wonderful tools, but they are definitely not exhaustive in the things that they can detect.
Yeah.
So again, I'll go back to the browser extension example just because it's something I've been working with the last couple of weeks. But if you don't have that enabled on the endpoint, and you're not ingesting those logs to the SIEM, you're not reasonably going to be able to track those extensions being installed that might be against policy or organizational policy or something else like that. So again, driving home that those workstation logs are really critical to have if you're really looking to get a jump on any sort of early IOCs that something is going on that does not belong.
Yeah. And moving along in terms of the events that you should be monitoring for, another one of those, because every time an attacker, either a ransomware crew, a state actor, a red team, or a pen tester, once they gain access to a host and they've been able to kind of like look through the host, identify all of the data from that host and how it relates to the network and everything, the next thing they need to get are credentials to start doing lateral movement, because many times they're going to be kind of like limited to what that user can do and how the credentials that they have access are. So one of the other events is going to be object access, which means that we're able to track when somebody's actually opening LSA on a system.
Right. And object access, when you talk about like if you actually go to the advanced security policy feature in GPO, you're going to enable logs. You open up object access. There's quite a bit contained within that section, right? There's stuff that touches on registry, file access. There's a lot that goes into that, just general object access. And I think there's a lot of challenges from defender and engineering perspectives on like what even does this mean really. But I know from work I've done in the past, and I'm sure Carlos also has some stuff as well, from an object access perspective, the top three that come to mind for me would be event ID 4663, event ID 4662, and event ID 5136. Carlos, do you have any other event IDs that you think would be super critical from that perspective?
No, I think those cover most of the behavior that I would associate to the actions that we take when we land in the system. Sadly, a lot of customers do not monitor for those, and they rely overly too heavily on the EDR. And let's face it, most ransomware crews out there have the money to pay for all types of EDR products through front companies. We saw it when the leaks from Conti were leaked and the leaks from other of the different actors. They do have research teams that are sending all of that stuff and bypassing EDRs, but bypassing the audit logs is a lot harder when they don't have those privileges. And these events actually are really good in terms of serving as a backup for you to be able to correlate with your EDR data if somebody's touching LSS and somebody's doing something to that process, which is critical, and to other parts of the system, especially around objects that are being accessed, registry keys, all of that stuff. Because that then takes us to the next one, which is file access. When it comes to what is the kind of like the trifecta that every pen tester, red teamer, and actor out there performs is once they land in the system, they're going to do credential harvesting, they're going to do situational awareness, and the next thing they're going to do is they're going to start looking for files. And they're going to start coming through all types of share for information. And in the case of ransomware, they have moved very, 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 very heavily here. And one of the main reasons for that is that EDRs have gotten so good at detecting the encryption side at the last stage of the attack, where they're dropping decryptors to encrypt everything, that now they have moved to what we called the double extortion technique, where they're going for all of those files, exfiltrating all of that. We've seen it now with AT&T. We've seen it with AutoZone. We've seen it with Cylance. We've seen it with many actors that were affected by Snowflake. We've seen it with other attacks out there. What they're going to do is they're going to grab all of those files. Then they're going to go like, if I'm not able to encrypt everything, or the EDR was so good that I was only able to encrypt like 4 or 5 systems, that extortion doesn't work. But me having your files and telling you, I'm going to make them public, I'm going to sell them, I'm going to send them to reporters because I found something shady, or I'm going to just send it to your competitors, it's a big one. So being able to monitor for share crawling, it's big. It's one of those known behaviors that we've seen out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of like a ransomware simulation, two of the event IDs that when we do like test simulation use cases on a purple team exercise, we look at a couple different events. One of the ones we do look at there is 4663. And specifically, we're usually looking for essentially excessive amounts of files being created within a given share path. And you're not going to be able, from my experience, most of the EDR tools that we've run this simulation with didn't catch that activity. They didn't flag it. They didn't recognize it as strange. So obviously that's getting to the point where there's already encryption happening. But if you can get a forewarning that something's happening, say you have 100+ files on a endpoint, and they're all named with weird extensions like CXY, XYZ, TD, whatever that extension may be, you get an alert that says, hey, this endpoint is doing something really weird and creating a bunch of files. That might give you a jump on being able to quarantine the host faster, to pull it off the network faster, so that the ransomware isn't potentially able to spread depending on the actor. And then going back to some of the other event IDs we've talked about, most of these ransomware actors, when they get in an environment, they're running things from the process command line. They're running, commands. They're running things that can be detected if you have those workstation logs that perhaps the EDR may not catch because it is a living off the land binary or something like that. So there's some criticality from that point as well.
Yeah. Another one that I think it's a big one, and this is one that I would say, as we're performing operations, if I see this enabling environment, it does impact greatly my operational tempo, is LDAP. Because any Windows environment, as soon as I land into that environment, I'm going to start doing LDAP queries to find all of the different hosts. So typically, me coming from the attacker side, and now I'm more on the defensive side nowadays, but back in the days when most of the stuff I was doing was attack, first I would enumerate all of the domain information. From there, I would move over to the sites and their subnets and the servers and those, because that will tell me, hey, so if I want to blend in my behavior, I'll target the domain controllers are in the site for the subnet that I am. Plus, I'm able to identify all of the subnets without generating a lot of traffic. Then I would go for the OUs. I will target then the OUs for computers and users for those. And all of that behavior is going to look off if you're logging LDAP filters. Why? Because when you look at Windows, everything that is doing object class equals asterisk. That's all it's doing. Windows by default, in terms of its effectiveness in LDAP queries, it's not that good. So any of that behavior is going to be a very big outlier when you start looking at the logs. And it's something that I was talking with Megan, and we were talking about, like, one of the now de facto tools out there that we were seeing everybody use in attacks is actually using AD Explorer.
Absolutely. Yeah. LDAP queries and LDAP logs, I think in terms of the scope of which we see them on purple team engagements, when we're working hands-on with clients and we're in their SIEM and we're, looking through things, I don't think that I have encountered a single organization who is actually ingesting LDAP logs into their environment. They can be, I think, a little bit unwieldy to enable, which may be part of it. I think a lot of people don't know that there's an event ID for that you can actually log that data into a SIEM. There's also volume to consider as well there. But the LDAP logs, in addition to, again, backing way up to early in the attack chain, yeah, LDAP queries are going to be run. It's when I'm on a pen test, one of the first things I'm doing is reconnaissance, doing exactly what Carlos just said, querying for domain controllers, getting information on the environment. And a lot of times, some of those early steps are LDAP queries, particularly if you're maybe not landing directly on a Windows host, or you find a Linux server you're on or something like that. But also in the case of a Windows host as well. So incredible value in terms of very early indicators that somebody is trying to get a lot of information from the environment. Also, a lot of value in baselining too. So knowing what LDAP queries are normal for your environment, critical. I also want to drive home the importance of baselining information in your environment. If you don't understand what is normal, you really can't see what's abnormal in a lot of cases. And then also, it has huge detection potential for some other kind of side things, like for lapse, for example. Lapse Query lapse is an actual LDAP request. So you can detect requests for lapse passwords. Lapse local administration passwords. It's a Microsoft utility, for those who aren't aware, to control local administrative passwords and stuff like that. But it's actually a LDAP query to the domain controllers to get that information. And you can actually see pretty close to the whole command that an attacker's running if they're running a tool like crack map exec or lapse dump, or some of the other various tools out there that do lapse requests. You can actually see the command there that was run, and you can use that as a detection point if you're trying to detect people who get access to lapse. And that is definitely something that, if an attacker finds that in the environment, is potentially a very high value target. It is also something that we see targeted in red teams and pen tests as well. So I think I wrote a blog post on that sometime. I think it was called Lapse in Judgment. If anybody wants to go look at that, there's actual detections in there as well that are based on other event IDs that we've mentioned in this particular webinar. So, 4662 is in there. And the LDAP query logs are also in there. So there's a lot of use cases for LDAP logs in terms of early reconnaissance, but also for detecting access to critical assets in the environment, like your lapse passwords, that are definitely a high value target.
Yep. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that everything that we're talking about is for you to be able to take action at the early stages of an attack. By doing this, you're impacting severely how far can that attacker move inside of your network. So when we start looking at some of the use cases, like, for example, ransomware detection, one of the things that we're going to be seeing is that as we are enabling for critical assets, all of these types of logs, and we're monitoring the workstation logs and all of that stuff, is that we are impacting and we're focusing on that initial behavior that the attacker needs to take, which is I landed in the box. I'm gaining situational awareness. So all of a sudden, LDAP is going to catch you there. And if we look, for example, at some of the other stuff, like my camera died. Yeah, I have my AC off, and I think it overheated.
Oh no.
So so what happens is that we're looking at all of that initial behavior that the attacker needs to do to be effective in the environment. And just by focusing on what he needs to do, we're affecting not only how fast can he move, but also what tooling. Because if all of a sudden you're catching him early, that means that he's going like, crap, I need to change my implant. Now I need to move to another implant that is going to provide me the same level of access. Also, if they're detecting me this quick, that means I need to do persistence, which means another risk that I have to incur on that is going to get me caught.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was a pretty huge discussion just on all the event IDs that Carlos and I have kind of flagged as, hugely critical. And just for the sake of the video, I'm just going to run through them really fast one more time, just so that you guys have that information with specific event IDs. So in this case, we're looking at event ID 4624, event ID 4625, event ID 4688, and or SysMon1 if you have SysMon, event ID 4657 for registry related events, event ID 4663, 4662, and 5136. And then also event ID 5145. And there may be additional event IDs for LDAP logs, but I think the one that I've worked with the most is event ID 1644. Carlos, are you aware of any others out there that from an LDAP perspective?
From the LDAP perspective, then this is where we can enhance a lot of our logging with EDRs, because Falcon actually logs LDAP queries. Windows for endpoint, Windows Defender for endpoint also does it. And that one does a very good job. It actually gathers a bit of extra telemetry, like what was the process that did the query, what was the query, and all of that stuff. There's also some ETW providers. There are some LDAP open source kind of tooling out there that I have to be honest, sometimes I do use it for research, but I wouldn't deploy it in a production environment. But yeah, this is where I think EDRs can actually enhance a lot of that data that we're able to get.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Sweet. Well, so those were the event IDs that we've kind of flagged. I know there was a question in the chat on like targeted event IDs to focus on when you're getting started, or, obviously we understand that there's a huge cost in terms of you can't just flip on all of your logs, nor would we necessarily want an org to do that, just because that can then become very counterproductive in terms of being able to actually search data effectively. But within that question, I actually provided a list of basic event windows logging that we actually provide to our clients when we're going in to do a purple team exercise as a minimum. And I just want to emphasize that that's at a minimum. Those are the event IDs that we find to be valuable when we're coming in to build detections.
Yeah, and also if you guys, if you're going into Sysmon, I have a full series on Sysmon in our YouTube channel. And one of the things that you're going to notice me mention again and again and again and again, and this addresses one of the questions that we got, is detuning, because all of these logs consume storage. But if you're using solutions like Sysmon, if you're doing solutions like Elastic that uses Wing Logbeat, if you're using the solution from Falcon for ingestion, most EDR, not EDR, most SIEM solutions, their ingesters actually support you filtering out events that you don't want. And this is where it gets to the point where there's a lot of friction in environments. When I talk with customers, like, you need to build a baseline, and they go like, oh, that's a lot of work. And I'm going like, dude, you don't want to be in an incident when I want to get all of the 4624s for a server, and I launch my query in your QRadar, and it tells me, oh yeah, I'll finish the query in 16 hours. And you're going like, I'm in the middle of an event. I need this data now. And it was because it was old and it wasn't indexed. and being able to filter out and going through that exercise of going like, what is normal behavior in my environment? Let me start filtering it out. Oh, what is normal behavior for this specific event? Let me start filtering out. And just go as you're building all of your detections and you're building all of that stuff, start looking at your SIEM and what is the cruft that is inside of there? What event IDs provide zero value to you? Like I see a lot of customers go like, oh no, give me all security, give me all application, give me all system. And I'm going like, why? You have gigs of data that you will never use. And it's very important that you go through that pruning process when it comes to your logs.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we all hate
Um,
it.
so somebody in the questions mentioned PowerShell logging too, and sort of along with LDAP logging,
Mm-hmm.
PowerShell logging, another really great way to detect things that maybe you can't
Yeah.
always see. Sometimes you can kind of see some of the PowerShell stuff within like 4688. I've seen some of that
Mm-hmm.
translate over. But if you enable script block logging, yes, absolutely, that can be another really valuable asset that we very uncommonly we just don't see that very often with clients either, in the same way as LDAP logging. So I think that's a really good call out, frankly. So I wanted to mention it live on the webinar.
And don't forget that there are two versions of PowerShell. There's
Yeah.
PowerShell, which is the open source version that you install that now you need to do a lot of the Azure stuff and all that stuff. And then there's Windows PowerShell, which is now deprecated that is included Windows. There are two different log sources for those, two different registry keys that you need to set to enable logging on those. And when it comes to script block logging, the way that PowerShell works is that you'll get a script block ID for it. And for the first time that it sees that script, it's going to include the script. Next time that it runs again, it's only going to give you the script block ID to save on storage. So do grow those EVTX files. Those do set a larger size for those,
Yes.
because you're going to then track that script block ID back to the source. I was in one environment where I saw that they actually enabled script block logging, and I went like, yeah, they did it. Awesome. And I was going at them and they were only holding 12 hours. And I'm going
Oh
like,
no.
the event happened a month ago. Now I need to search it and it's not in the SIEM.
Ah, yeah.
So you you grow it. I had a bunch of script log
Absolutely.
IDs that were not useful, but I knew that something was happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then just to kind of put a cap on that particular part of the discussion, if I referred to the blog post that I wrote previously for labs related stuff, in that blog post, the only reason I'm mentioning it is I do a walkthrough on how I enabled like LDAP logging on my lab environment and how I did enable PowerShell script block logging as well. So I believe you can take a look at that and see if it helps if you're looking to either do it in a lab environment to just play around with the logs and get more familiar with them, or in an enterprise environment on a much smaller level. So,
Yeah. On the part about Azure logs, that is one that that one touches some nerves for me, because Microsoft decided that a lot of those logs are going to be behind different licensing levels, and they tend to be a bit painful to deal with those. In addition to that, it's important to, as you're working with all of your Azure logs, that there's a lot of cruft in them that is not valuable, and you need to match Azure with your Office 365 logs. Azure logs on themselves, they're useful for some types of attacks, but not all of them. You need to, many times, in fact, I think almost all of them that I've been in engagement, I've needed to correlate Office 365 logs with Azure logs and start kind of intercalating through those. At least my experience mostly is on IR on that side, where we've actually built internal tools where we do all of that correlation and we put that in spreadsheets that then our IR people use to hunt for malicious activity. From a purple team perspective, Megan, what would you recommend on the Azure side?
I definitely do have some recommendations for it. Not necessarily prepared and on me right now at this moment. But in terms of the Azure engagements that we've run, sign-in logs are important. Activity logs are important. And then regular event IDs also still apply, even in an Azure environment and stuff like that. So I don't have a list handy with me right now, unfortunately, but I will see if I can dig up some resources and hopefully we can publish that and get it to interested viewers. So
Yeah, on the question LDAP, what should we be concerned of? I would say build a baseline. So for example, let me see if I can share it here. So this is raw LDAP data for a client. And this is throughout a month that I've been gathering all of this data. You're going to see that almost all of your logs, as I'm highlighting, this is highlighting everything else, is object class equals asterisk. And then there are a couple of DNS ones that are almost related to GPOs. There are going to be others that are going to be related to certificate authorities. And outside of that, almost all of the behavior that you're going to find is going to be for object class asterisk. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Command Shift Plus, is it? Yeah. So as you can see, almost all of these logs are going to be object category asterisk, object class asterisk. So it's very, very, very easy for you to kind of like build a baseline for LDAP. It's easier than any of the other logs to build one for. That's why I highly recommend that you enable that and start looking through that. And this is where actually EDRs and solutions like Windows Endpoint Protection kind of like are super good at this because they get you all of that data, plus they enhance that data.
absolutely. So in terms of we've done a lot of chatting about event IDs and Windows logging so far, probably because most organizations we run into are primarily Windows Active Directory and or Azure environments and stuff like that, or Entra ID, depending on which branding you're going with there. But there's also other logs we do recommend ingesting as well if they are applicable to your environment. And one of the big ones that we have on that list has to do with your firewalls, which I believe we see ingested more often than not. And then also your network devices, so switches, routers, etc. And getting the net flow data from those if you can as well. Some SIEMs allow you to ingest both separately and they're licensed differently. I'm thinking of QRadar specifically when I say that. That's another one that we would really recommend. Carlos, did you have any additional feedback on the firewall stuff or?
I think one of the parts that looking into those is look at the amount of data per process that was exfiltrated, because I've been in several engagements where here comes the guys from the board, here comes the guys from legal, and one of the first things that they're going to ask you was data exfiltrated. And you're not going to be able to answer that important question with somebody with several pay grades above you breathing down your neck unless you have that. And that question gets asked a lot during the entire engagement. Oh, we found this server was data exfiltrated. Can you tell me with 100% truthful? Why? Because that is needed for you when you do your sec filing K8, if the attack was material or not. It will depend what data was exfiltrated or not. You'll be able to say if it was a material event or not. And that has very big legal and financial impact on the company. So that is one of those that if you're going to do NetFlow data and firewall log data, look at how much data was moved when by a given process or session on the host, and also NetFlow data that you're going to be using by time. Like this host at this hour, this connection moved this amount of data, even if you don't have the process information.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also ties back into our event IDs as well in terms of exfiltration, making sure you're monitoring for SMB share crawling and other ways of getting access to critical data in your environment from like file servers or workstations, capturing passwords and stuff like that. That all sort of ties back into the same thing, and you can really track the movement of that data if you have those firewall logs in addition to the event IDs. Um, we also do recommend at a base level trying to ingest, if you have critical Linux servers in your environment, if you can pull logs from those as well for use cases, particularly if you have critical infrastructure to see what commands are being run on the command line for your Linux hosts. That is also another potential way of moving a lot of data or getting access to data, you know, for example, taking snapshots of servers if people get access to your ESXi environment and moving that off. Again, that ties right back into the firewall logs, ties right back into everything else we've talked about so far. And then also trying to ingest logs from your EDR tools and having those in the SIEM, as well as ensuring things like your logging from your DCs, your servers, and again, your workstations, and not just the EDR logs, but the event IDs specifically.
And I know that one of the questions that we had was around remote workers. There's not a very good solution there outside of you having them send their data to the cloud and having a solution like Sentinel in the cloud or QRadar in the cloud to send all of that data over there. Now, when it comes to the cost side of the cloud storage, you can actually sync that data back to on-prem if you want to, or you can leave it in the cloud instance and then just bring your local over into the cloud. Sadly, there's no perfect solution when it comes to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some tools I think that can, for example, like store logs on the endpoint until it's reconnected to the network, the internal company network, and then it will send those logs up. Obviously, there's some challenges and dangers with that particular stuff because it can send bursts of data into the SIEM, which you know, could spike your license requirements and stuff like that. I think there are some tools that do that as well. But yeah, that is definitely a challenge, and with workforces becoming more remote and you know, not geocentric, that it's a challenge, absolutely.
And that's why important that you start logging, not logging, but going through your logs and bringing them. Do we need this a specific event ID? Instead of pushing everything from application, instead of pulling everything from system, it becomes like, do we need this event ID? Yes, no, we don't. We don't have a detection for it. Let's scrap it. What about this other one? Do we need it? Yes, no. Does it fit into our detection paradigms? Do we want to index it? Yes, no, scrap it. And that is an exercise of constant evaluation that you need to be going through.
Absolutely. And I saw a comment on the chat again here that mentioned that nxlog caches logs until it is connected. I believe that's true, and that's actually the tool I was thinking of when I was saying that, which sort of provides a perfect segue to the final section of our webinar here, which we will go through rather quickly here. But in terms of, so we know the significant logs, we know why it's important now, but how do we actually set up effective logging? How do we operate in a way that we are not overwhelming our SIEMs entirely with a bunch of data that maybe is not so relevant? And one of the big parts of that is absolutely applying log filtering. So this could be multiple different ways of running, right? It could be tools, log aggregators like Cribble, nxlog. There's a few other tools out there that do that, that allow you to kind of centralize your logging and then filter it before it gets sent up to the SIEM. There's tools like WEF or WEC, Windows Event Collection, that allow you to set up subscriptions and forward event data to like a centralized server. So that way you can then send those logs up to the SIEM via an agent or however else that works. If it's a, you know, Rapid7 agent or a QRadar agent, a WinCollect agent or something like that. What else, Carlos, do you have on that front? Any other specific?
I would say a unsung hero is WEF and WEC. Like I've worked with the Dart team from Microsoft, and that is kind of like when they land on a customer in the middle of an engagement, that's the first thing they're going to pull. And I've actually seen them in action have this collection of filters for the specific events. How bad do they want those? Push that via GPO to the entire environment to one host, and then just collect those.
Yeah.
And since it is a binary compressed XML, doesn't take a lot of data, and they're able to keep that as they're performing their investigations. So that's a very nice tool that I would highly recommend that you play with.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and then I think probably one of the last couple of points that we have here is backing up your SIM data. I know Carlos and I were talking about this again, and with a use case like ransomware, um, one of the risks is the ransomware hits your SIM and encrypts all your log data and impedes or devastates your ability to conduct an investigation. So Carlos is
Attackers will go
very
after it.
yeah, absolutely. It is like with most things in security, right? There's always that question of who is watching the watcher, who is protecting the tools that are doing the protecting. And so making sure that you're monitoring your defense tools, your EDR agents. There's a lot of EDR agents that can be used maliciously as well through API calls and can be used to control an environment. So
Yeah.
in general, you
A
know,
recent engagement, Velvet Ant, they got
right.
access to the Falcon instance. And one of the things that they did is that for CrowdStrike, they created an API key, and then they use CrowdStrike to start running commands across the entire environment to gather information. And then they started just using that to then exfiltrate the data and then to encrypt all of the systems from the EDR itself. And when one of the targets that was over in Taiwan started looking through stuff, oh, we monitor all of this stuff for Windows. Oh, are you monitoring the logons, API creations for your security tools? No, we didn't. That was a
And
gap.
on top of that, it's filtered out of all of your detections
Yes.
because, for example, like a Rapid7 service account or loads of other tools require service accounts with high level of privileges because of the nature of the work that they do. And because those tools, especially with vulnerability management stuff, Nessus, Qualys, whatever, they generate a lot of activity in the network. Well, they get tuned out of detections because you sort of have to do that. But then on the flip side of that, what happens if an attacker gets access to those accounts, cracks an SPN perhaps that's associated with the account and is able to get that, and it happens to be,
Mhm.
the Nessus agent domain admin account. So um, also very applicable.
Cool. So I think we're at the end of our webinar. We went a bit over it. As you can see, Megan and I, we get excited when we're talking about this subject. Uh, but yeah, there's a lot more to talk about this. So probably in the future, we'll do another webinar on this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to talk about, and obviously getting into the technical details of things of like breaking down specific event IDs is something that I don't always see being done on a large level. And again, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one.